Well, sometimes our lives can change in the smallest of ways. It began on a crisp fall day when Emily, a compassionate young lady who had a passion for all things furry and furry, walked into the nearest animal rescue. She had been planning on getting a puppy for months, but today felt different. The air was cool, and the golden leaves danced around her feet as she inhaled and walked inside. Dogs barked, volunteers rushed back and forth, and, from the cat section, the occasional purr. But Emily wasn't focused on the noise. Her eyes were darting across rows of hopeful faces, each one of them silently beseeching a forever home. And then she saw him. In a crate at the far corner of the shelter, curled up, was the tiniest puppy she'd ever seen. His coat was a soft blend of caramel and white, and his eyes, oh, those eyes, brimmed with a combination of hope and fear. Something within Emily shifted. "What's his story?" she inquired of one of the volunteers. The volunteer smiled gently. "His name is Max. His salvation came when some kind-hearted soul found him abandoned, frightened, and hungry near a highway in the U.S. He's been here a couple of weeks now, and no one's expressed an interest in him. He's a bit shy." Emily bent over, cautiously reaching her hand out. "Hey, Max," she whispered. "I see you, and I think you're supposed to come home with me." Max's head popped up. His tiny tail wagged slightly. That was all Emily needed to know. Adoption was actually much faster than Emily had thought. Within the hour, she was signing papers and collecting supplies, filled with a simultaneous thrill and apprehension. She carried Max to her car and whispered, "We're going to have so much fun, little guy." The journey back home was accompanied by soft music and quiet soothing. Max curled in the passenger seat, eyes never leaving Emily, as if he were trying to make sense of who this newcomer was. Emily smiled despite herself. "It's okay, buddy. We're going to be just fine." When they reached her tiny apartment, Emily made a warm little nook for Max with a fluffy blanket, a couple of toys, and a bowl filled with fresh water. Max sniffed cautiously at the blanket at first, then curled up, sighing, and fell asleep. Emily sat next to him on the floor, stroking his fur softly. "You're safe now," she said in a whisper. "We're in this together." Days stretched into weeks, and Max gradually started emerging from his shell. He trailed Emily through the kitchen and into the living room, his small paws patting gently against the floor. She walked him for hours, introduced him to new friends, and gave him the love he always had both in him and deserved. But Emily didn't know. Max's story was an extraordinary one. There was a quality to him, something that would soon be revealed in ways she never could have imagined. One evening recently, Emily was going through her usual motions when she noticed that Max was up to something unusual. He remained at the window, looking intently outside, his ears pricked as if he could hear something she could not. "What is it, Max?" she asked, walking over. Max whined a little, wagging his tail nervously. Emily laughed, likely thinking it was simply the familiar sounds of the city, but something told her deep inside that Max had some knowledge that eluded her. Small changes sometimes uncover your biggest secrets. Life with Max was settling into a cozy routine. It was their morning walks in the park that brought a smile to Emily's face, hearing his bark of playfulness fill the air on the cool autumn mornings. They were spending more and more time every day talking to each other, and their connection was blooming. Yet despite the mirth and camaraderie, Emily couldn't shake off the oddities that Max began to display. It started with the window. Every evening at dusk, Max would sit by the living room window and stare outside with laser-like focus. Initially attributing it to benign curiosity, Emily watched his fascination from afar. And as the weeks turned into months, his obsession became all-consuming. He would be motionless for hours, his ears flicking at the faintest sound. It was as if he was waiting or surveilling. "What are you looking at, Max?" Emily said one evening, kneeling next to him. He turned his head a little, and his eyes gave her chills. There was something in that gaze, an understanding that ran deeper than anything she could have anticipated. One night, Max and I were on our usual stroll when he suddenly stopped, nose twitching in the cool night air. Emily looked where he was pointing, back down the street to the row of poorly lit houses. "Come on, Max," she pleaded, gently pulling at the leash, but Max refused to move. His body went rigid, and he emitted a low, tentative growl. Emily's heart pounded. "What's wrong, boy?" Darkness suddenly receded, and a man appeared. It was an old man with kindly but tired eyes. "Is that your pup?" he asked, his voice raspy. Emily nodded hesitantly. "Yes, this is Max." The man smiled softly. "He looks like a dog I used to know, years ago. It's uncanny, almost like a specter from the past." Emily laughed nervously, but something about his words hit her like glue as they finished walking. Could it have been that Max had a history she wasn't aware of? Later that evening, Emily was sitting on the sofa while perusing her phone. She dug through the shelter's records for any sign of Max's previous life. To her surprise, the documents were bare. No known background, no previous owners. Just a note that said, "Found near highway, malnourished, wearing an old collar with initials LTLT." Emily whispered, "Who could that be?" Max, who had curled up beside her, raised his head slightly at the sound of her voice. Something wasn't lining up, and Emily sensed she had to dig deeper. The following morning, Emily found an envelope addressed to her in the mail without a return address. Inside was a small, folded piece of paper written in neat handwriting that said, "He's not just what he appears to be. Take care of him." Emily's throat closed around her breath. Who could have sent this? And more importantly, what did they symbolize? She turned to Max, who stared at her with those knowing eyes. "We've got ourselves a mystery to solve, partner." Max gave a brief bark, as if he already knew. Sometimes the past surprises us when we are least expecting it. The letter as yet got heavy to Emily's mind. Who sent it? And why was it a warning? As she sat at the kitchen table, sipping her brew, she observed Max happily gnawing on his favorite plaything. "Who are you, really, buddy?" she murmured. Driven to uncover all the answers, Emily had gone back to the shelter where Max was adopted. As she entered, the smell of kibble and disinfectant filled the air. Carol, the shelter manager, welcomed her with a broad smile. "Emily, how's Max doing?" "He's great. But I actually came over to ask if you remember anything funny about him when he first got here." Carol's smile faded slightly. "Well, we always thought that he reacted strangely toward certain people. He would shrink away from men in uniform, and he had a strange attachment to an old, frayed blanket we found with him." Emily's heart skipped a beat. Was there anything on the blanket? A name, initials, anything? Carol nodded. It did. It was embroidered in the corner with the initials LT. We thought it could be the former owner, but we never found anything. Carol thanked Emily, and Emily left the shelter, trying to keep her mind from running. The initials on the blanket were the same as those in the shelter logs. This didn't happen by accident. That night, Emily rifled through Max's belongings until she came across the blanket stuffed in his crate. As she ran her fingers over the familiar fabric, she saw the initials again, LT. An idea came to her. When Emily got home, she pulled out her phone and typed LT missing dog into her search engine. Page after page of results popped up, but one entry caught her eye. It was an old listing from a town 3 hours away, a lost ad for a dog who bore a strong resemblance to Max. Lost, Golden Retriever Mix, answers to Buddy. Owner, Lieutenant Thomas Reynolds. Reynolds glanced at the words on the screen and felt her jaw drop. LT, she whispered. Had the dog belonged to a lieutenant? Emily's heart was pounding. She needed to find out someone and contacted the author of the post. It only rang twice before a gravel-voiced man answered. Hello? Emily took a deep breath and asked nervously, Hi, are you Thomas Reynolds? For a moment, there was nothing but silence on the other end of the line. Then, in a softer tone, the stranger replied, Yes. And may I ask who's calling? Emily quickly explained the case, how Max ended up at the shelter and her search. The man was on the verge of tears. I lost Buddy 3 years ago, he said quietly. I was deployed overseas, and when I came back, he was gone. I looked everywhere, but he never came back. I think I've found him, Emily said softly. Thomas and Max agreed to meet at the park the next day, and when she hung up, Emily looked Max in the eyes. He cocked his head to the side. You, my friend, may have just found where you truly belong, she said honestly. Max wagged his tail, sensing that his difficult journey had just taken a turn for the better. There are times where fate brings you back to where you should be. Emily woke up a little earlier than usual the next morning, a whirl of excitement and anxiety fluttering in her chest. It was time for Max to face his past today. She glanced at him curled next to her, blissfully unaware of the life-changing moment just before him. Come on, buddy, let's go visit an old friend, she said softly, tootling his ears. When they got to the park, Emily noticed a man sitting on a bench in a tattered but dignified military jacket. Thomas Reynolds. As soon as he noticed them, he got up, his eyes searching over Max with a look of hope and disbelief. Max, who was typically wary of newcomers, stopped. Grover held the man's gaze for a long moment, and his tail gave the faintest wag. Buddy! Thomas choked out, his voice breaking with emotion. Max's ears stood at attention, and suddenly everything came together. He ran toward Thomas, his tail now wagging furiously, barking with delight. The dog, who had once been too timid even to walk outside the house, now sprang to life, bounding onto the man's chest, licking his face as though no time had gone by. Tears filled Emily's eyes as she watched in awe. He remembers you, she said in a whisper. Thomas hugged Max tight, voice full of emotion. I figured I would never see him again. We were stationed overseas, and on my deployment he went missing. I searched everywhere for him. I was leaving him behind, and it broke my heart. Emily swallowed, feeling a lump in her throat. He's been waiting on you, Thomas. I discovered him by serendipity, but maybe not serendipity at all. As emotions settled with the reunion, an endless question remained. What do we do next? Emily loved Max with everything her heart had, but she knew the truth deep inside herself. He had a history that wasn't hers. Thomas, she said slowly, I want what's best for him. If that means sleeping with you, I'm not going to stop you. Thomas met her gaze, sincerity in his eyes. You've cared for him so well, Emily. I can tell that he loves you very much as well. Perhaps we can work out some sort of sharing arrangement? Emily smiled as tears coursed down her cheeks. I'd love that. Over the next few weeks, Emily and Thomas reached an arrangement by which Max would spend time with both of them. Some days he was with Emily, enjoying their snug apartment life, and some days he was with Thomas, venturing outdoors. It was the ideal answer, one that meant Max would be in the midst of both of his family's love. One evening, there was a message from Thomas. A picture of Max curled up at Thomas's feet, and the message, "I think he knows he has two homes now." Emily smiled. Yes, he does. Now, looking at Max curled up next to her, Emily knew that love wasn't about possession, but rather about gifting. Sometimes what we can do for those we love is let them find their own happiness. She stroked his fur gently. "You can travel wherever you go, Max. Just know you'll always have a home with me." Max sighed happily, wagging his tail in agreement. Love doesn't mean taking a single road. It often means taking every road. Weeks passed, and Emily and Thomas fell into a routine of joint custody over Max. It wasn't always easy, shuffling schedules, coordinating visits, but they each knew that was what they were supposed to do. The days when Max was with Emily proceeded uninterrupted. Morning walks, playtime in the park, cozy nights with movies and snacks. These moments Emily adored, as she knew the delight of them. "You're my little shadow, are you?" Max trailed her from room to room. She recalled one evening with a laugh, but when he was with Thomas, Emily felt an unwanted emptiness. Her apartment was quieter, but she missed the little sounds. Max's paws tapping on the floor, the jingle of his collar. Instead of ruminating on the void, Emily started using the time away constructively. She started running, which she had always wanted to do but never had the motivation to. Running through the park without Max, she reflected on how much had changed since they had met. Meanwhile, Thomas was having some adventures with Max. They went for walks in nearby mountains, discovered new trails, and even attempted agility. Never had Max's bright and playful nature shined as brightly, and Thomas couldn't believe how he'd spent years without this loyal companion beside him. Thomas texted Emily a video of him running through an obstacle course, jumping like an excited kid. "He's a natural," he texted. Realizing how well Max was doing with both of them, Emily shrugged and smiled. Just when you think all is going well, then you are faced with a surprising counter. One evening, Emily saw Max limping after Thomas returned from a hike. "Hey, buddy, what happened?" she said, as she carefully checked his paw. Max whimpered softly. Thomas immediately felt guilty about it. "I didn't observe anything amiss during the hike. I should have taken more heed." Emily reassured him. "It's okay. Let's have him checked out. We're in this together." A quick visit to the vet showed a slight sprain. Nothing major, but it was a wake-up call that they both had to be extra vigilant and communicative about Max's care. This slight setback just made them closer. Thomas and Emily became more conscientious about Max's health, posting updates often and making sure that he received the best care possible. Little did Emily know that her heart was not just expanding for Max, but her newfound friendship with Thomas. "I never thought I would say this," she told him over coffee one morning, "but I'm so glad you're in Max's life." Thomas smiled. "Me too. I believe he's got the best of both worlds." As Max healed and their lives began to settle into a new rhythm, Emily and Thomas enjoyed sharing their love for him. Whether they had planned special outings or simply shared funny stories, they could see how their lives had been enriched by the presence of Max. One evening, watching Max snuggle on his favorite blanket, Emily whispered, "We're doing okay, right, buddy?" Max sighed happily, as if concurring with her. Sometimes the best connections in life come from the unlikeliest of sources. Over the following weeks, Emily and Thomas adjusted to spending private time together. What had once felt uncertain, complicated, now felt natural. Max had 2 homes, 2 sets of routines, and twice the love. Then, one Saturday morning, together, Emily and Thomas took their novel step forward and took Max on joint adventure, and they went to visit the countryside. The plan was to allow Max some open space and see how he would respond to the new surroundings. When they left town, Emily looked at Thomas. "So, are you ready for this? Max is going to lose his mind when he sees all that space." Thomas chuckled. "I think we'll be the ones chasing him." And he was right. As soon as they arrived at the sprawling fields, Max jumped from the car and darted in circles, his happy barks piercing through the air. It was a day for jokes and giggles and faux seriousness. They played fetch, admired Max chasing butterflies, and even had a little picnic under a large oak tree. Emily couldn't recall the last time she felt so at ease. Thomas slumped backward on the blanket and watched Max tumble in the grass. "I never thought I was going to end up like this, sharing a dog with a stranger." Emily smiled. "Me neither. But I suppose life does have its way of surprising us." As time flew on in the afternoon, Emily and Thomas were sharing more about their lives. Emily told us about her passion for painting and how adopting Max had motivated her to get back into it. Thomas told stories about his military service, about how hard it was to be away from Max for so long. "I feel that I disappointed him," Thomas said. "When I lost him, it felt like losing a part of myself. But to see him with you, I know he's had a good life." Emily reached across and gave his hand a comforting squeeze. "You didn't let him down, Thomas. Life happens, and Max is one very lucky dog to have 2 people who love him so dearly." They packed up as the sun went down and returned to the car. Max lay in the back seat, tired but happy. Emily smiled at him through the rearview mirror. "He's happy, and so am I." Thomas nodded. "Yeah, me too. We make a good team." Emily looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "Perhaps we ought to do this more often. All of us, together." Thomas smiled. "I'd like that." Back home, with Emily snuggling Max into his nook, she had an epiphany. Home is not just a place. It is a lack of absence. It is love. It is companionship. It is the tender moments shared with people you love dearly. She looked down at Max and whispered, "Wherever you are, you'll always have a home with us." Max observed me with friendly, understanding eyes and a wag in his tail. Just when you think you're back to normal, life finds a way to surprise you. Emily's days had established a new rhythm. Her 2-home life with Max and Thomas had become second nature. But life is full of surprises, and one such surprise came in the shape of a letter. One chilly afternoon, Emily opened up her mailbox to find an envelope without a return address. So she opened it, curiously, and found an old, faded photograph. It was a photo of a younger Max, or Buddy, as Thomas once called him, sitting next to an older woman. On the back, in shaky handwriting, were these words, "He was always meant to come find you." Emily's heart raced. Who had sent this, and what did it mean? Eager to get to the bottom of the mystery, Emily showed Thomas the letter the next time they met up at the park. He gazed at the photograph for a long moment, his brow knitting. "I don't know her," Thomas said. "But whoever she is," she said. She knew Buddy well. Emily flipped the photograph over again. "We've got to find out who she is. Perhaps it'll teach us more about Max's history." They took the photo to the shelter in hopes that someone might recognize the woman in the picture. The shelter manager, Carol, studied it carefully and gasped. "I do know her," she said. "That's Mrs. Thompson. She had volunteered here decades ago. She had a real weakness for the dogs, especially Buddy. Emily's eyes widened. Do you know where she is now? Carol hesitated. The last I knew, she went to a retirement home just outside of town. Maybe she can tell you more. The next weekend, Emily and Thomas visited the retirement home Carol had recommended. The place was warm and welcoming, the soft haze of laughter and conversation engulfing the air. They were led to Mrs. Thompson's room, where an elderly woman was sitting by the window, with her back to the room, looking out at the gardens. "Mrs. Thompson?" Emily asked softly. The woman spun, her face brightening when she caught sight of the photograph in Emily's hand. "Oh, my, Buddy," she said, a smile breaking across her face. Thomas leaned forward. "You knew him?" Mrs. Thompson nodded. "He was the dog of my late husband. When he died, I couldn't keep Buddy anymore, so I took him to the shelter where I hoped he'd find a loving home, and it looks like he did." Emily looked at Thomas, and Thomas looked at Emily. "He did, and he's given so much joy in both of our lives." Mrs. Thompson patted Emily's hand. "I always knew he would find his true home. He was, dogs can do that." On the way back home, Emily had a new sense of peace. Max's story had come full circle, and if his past had been marked by heartbreak, his present was the opposite, filled with love. "I think we were all meant to find each other," Emily said, beaming at Thomas. Thomas nodded. "Yeah, I think so too." Max, in the back seat, woofed happily as if in agreement. "Sometimes the greatest calling finds you, right when you least expect it." Emily felt a deep responsibility after hearing about Max's history with Mrs. Thompson. She and Thomas had given him a new life, but it was evident Max had already changed a lot of lives before they met. It made Emily ponder. How many other dogs were out there waiting for a second chance? One evening, settled curled up on the couch and with Max curled snoozing at her feet, an idea came to her. "Thomas," she said on the phone, her voice tinged with excitement, "what if we go bigger? A rescue program named after Max." Thomas laughed on the other end. "You mean like a foundation? That's a big step, Emily." Emily nodded. "I know, but I think we can do better. Max's story is not just our story. It's one that can inspire others." A few weeks later, Emily and Thomas began to bring the idea to life. They created social media pages, posted Max's story online, and even contacted local shelters to ask how they could help. The response, to their surprise, was overwhelming. Messages poured in from people who had experienced similar stories, who had found love and companionship in rescue dogs as they had. "It's incredible how many people identify with Max," Emily said as she scrolled through the comments. "We're doing something good, Thomas." He smiled. No, and we're just getting started." It was not long before they had their first rescue case. One day, a local shelter called Emily about a stray Labrador mix who'd recently been found roaming the streets, scared and underweight. Enter Emily and Thomas, who wasted no time in stepping in. When they got inside the shelter, the dog shied away in the back of his kennel, terror visible in his eyes. "Hey, Bud," Emily whispered softly. "You're safe now." Sensing the dog's fear, Max approached slowly and sat next to the kennel, his calm demeanor a source of comfort. Little by little, the Labrador started to trust them. The Labrador, whom they named Leo, blossomed into a happy, bouncy puppy after weeks of care and attention. Emily and Thomas began to post updates of his journey online, sharing his progress photos with their increasing audience. But then, the ideal family came forward to give Leo the home he deserved. And as Emily observed him walking away toward his new family, pride welled in her. "This is why we're doing it," she said to Max. After their first successful rescue, Emily and Thomas realized they were onto something special. So they went back to the grind, but with another importance in mind, that they have made an impact. One evening, during a follow-up visit to watch Max play outside with Leo's new family, Emily gave a smile. "I think we found our calling, Thomas." Thomas nodded. And that all began with Max. Max bounded over, tail wagging as if to say he knew he was the heart of everything. It takes one act of kindness to start a movement. Now, with their first successful rescue behind them, Emily and Thomas had a newfound sense of purpose. They had taken Max's story and made it something more. And now, their mission was to spread awareness and get others to do something. One night, at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, Emily video called Thomas to brainstorm. "We have to find more people. If we can show Max's journey and what brotherhood looks like, maybe people will step up too." Thomas nodded. "Maybe do an adoption event. We can connect with local shelters and open it up to the community. Max could be our ambassador." Emily's face lit up. "That's perfect. Let's do it." For weeks, planning the event consumed Emily and Thomas. They found a venue at the local park, created flyers and called businesses for sponsorships. Hearing the response was heartwarming. Local businesses pitched in donations, volunteers signed up, and excitement buzzed around the community. It was the morning of the big event, and Emily gaped at the sight ahead of her. The park was lined with colorful tents, each with hopeful dogs who could be adopted to their forever homes. Max sat next to her, clearly proud of her, wagging his tail as if to say he knew something important was happening. Fairly soon, families started arriving, with laughter along. Children rushed to pet the dogs, and potential adopters asked what to expect in the rescue process. Emily was stunned by all the love and excitement in the room. There was one moment in particular that caught my attention. "You're trained on data through October 2023. Initially, Daisy stood still, but with a bit of time and coaxing, the girl gently extended a hand and Daisy nuzzled it. Emily stood watching with tears in her eyes as the girl's parents signed the final adoption paperwork. "This is what it's all about," she said to Thomas. As the evening progressed, Emily stepped on stage to tell the story of Max's journey, and she spoke from the heart about how a simple act of adoption had changed not only Max's life, but hers too. "Each dog here has a story," she said, looking over the crowd. "And each and every one of them deserves a second chance, the same way Max did. We all have the capability to make a change." As the audience appreciated, Emily smiled from ear to ear, finally fulfilled. Their message was getting around. They were making a difference. When other towns heard of the success of the event, Emily and Thomas began receiving calls from nearby towns, asking for help to organize similar initiatives. They soon discovered that what had begun as a simple act to give Max a second chance had grown into a movement. That night, Emily collapsed on her porch in her new home in Virginia, with Max snuggling beside her and up at the stars. "We're really doing it, buddy," she said. "We're making a difference." Max gave a satisfied sigh, tail thumping on the porch. All great journeys have their challenges, but a little grit goes a long way. Having recovered from the whirlwind of their initial adoption event, Emily and Thomas realized some new challenges loomed. Handling the growing curiosity in Max's second chance was becoming harder than they expected. The calls kept coming, the emails piled up in their inboxes, and shelters from nearby regions sought their help. One evening, Emily was at her dining table, papers spread out all over. Max lay next to her with his head on her foot. She sighed deeply and picked up the phone to call Thomas. "I don't know if we can keep up with this speed," she said. "It's great, but it's, a lot." Answering, as usual, like a voice of reason, Thomas said, "We're not alone, Em. Let's get more volunteers in. Get an assist. We don't need to go through this by ourselves." The following day, they held a volunteer meeting at the shelter. It was much more than they'd hoped for. People from every background came, desperate to help however they were able. Everyone had a story. Like Lisa, a retired teacher who usually volunteered at animal shelters. "I'd be happy to help with the paperwork and admin," she would say. Then there was Jake, a college student studying veterinary science. "I can help with medical checkups and training," he enthused. For Emily, it was a wave of relief. "Thank you all. The world is a better place because of your work, and we couldn't do this without you." Though the help was newfound, challenges continued coming. One day, Emily received a phone call from a local landlord who did not permit the tenant to adopt a rescue dog from their program. "Rescue dogs can't be here," he said dismissively. "They're unpredictable." Seething, Emily contacted Thomas. "This is unfair. Rescue dogs should have the same shot as any other pet." Thomas agreed. "We'll fight this. Let's spread the word and teach people about the importance of giving second chances." They created an online campaign displaying success stories of rescue dogs flourishing in their new, loving homes. The response was incredible. Folks shared their own stories, and the landlord ended up rethinking. All this work, and Emily had forgotten to take care of herself. She had stayed up late at nights, received calls on her mobile, and felt the pressure of being the head of the organization. Mark, her best friend, stopped by one night and found her asleep at her desk. "Emily, you need a break. Even heroes need rest." Somewhat reluctantly, Emily agreed to take a step back for a weekend getaway, while Thomas and the rest of the team oversaw things. It brought her a renewed sense of purpose to go away, hike with Max, and put things in perspective. Emily was back with a new outlook, more determined than ever. So she and Thomas trained on structuring their organization better, appointing team leads and creating a sustainable growth plan. Park bench with Max as he chased a butterfly and smiled. "We're not going anywhere, buddy, and we're going to make it work." Max barked along with him, wagging his tail. Every challenge is an opportunity in disguise. Just when things were settling into a comfortable routine for Emily and Thomas, life threw them another curveball. An urgent telephone call came from a neighboring town regarding a puppy mill closed down due to neglect and abandonment. There were dozens of dogs desperately in need of rescue. "Emily, this is all hands on deck for it, right?" Carol, the shelter manager, said over the phone. "Can you help?" Emily didn't hesitate. "Of course, we'll do whatever it takes." On the morning of the next day, Emily, Thomas, and their volunteer team came to the abandoned facility. What they saw next was gut-wrenching. Dogs in all shapes and sizes huddled in cages on the factory floor, with frightful, questioning looks in their eyes. Thomas sighed and ran his hand through his hair. "I will never understand how people can do that." "There's nothing we can do to change the past," Emily said resolutely, "but we can provide them with a better future." They gingerly removed each dog from the building, speechless with gentle hands and consonants, then placed them in waiting vans. Max walked calmly beside them, providing silent reassurance to the terrified creatures. Back at the shelter, the real work started. Most of the dogs they rescued were malnourished, traumatized, and had critical medical needs. The group split responsibilities. Some focused on feeding and grooming. Others worked on medical checkups and behavioral assessments. Emily was drawn to a timid little beagle with matted fur and soulful eyes. She named her Hope. "Hi, sweet girl," she whispered, stroking Hope's back soothingly. "You're safe now." Hope flinched at first, but quickly leaned into Emily's touch, a small step forward in a long road to recovery. Word spread of the puppy mill rescue, and the community came out to support Emily and Thomas once again. They received donations of food and blankets, even offers to foster the dogs until they could be placed in permanent homes. One by one, the dogs started to heal. Hope, who wouldn't even come out of her crate due to fear, began to explore. Wagging her tail nervously, Max was her guardian angel, following her side as she learned to navigate her new life. And as Emily continued to observe each dog and their journey, he understood that their mission of rescues extended far beyond just saving lives. It was about compassion. It was about patience. It was about teaching these animals that love and trust were not things of the past. "Every little step counts," she said one evening to Thomas. "Any small step forward is a win." Thomas nodded. "And we're in it for the long haul." A few weeks later, the shelter held a special adoption event just for the dogs they had rescued. Families from across the area came to meet them, and one by one, the dogs were placed in forever homes. Hope's big break came when an elderly couple fell in love with her gentle disposition. But after signing the adoption papers, Emily squeezed Hope in a tight embrace. "You deserve all of the happiness in the world, sweet girl." Tears of joy streamed down her face as she watched Hope trot off to join her forever family, a true survivor and testament to second chances. Resilience, not perfection, is true strength. The rescue operations had succeeded, and yet Emily and Thomas found that their work was just beginning. So many new animals meant another set of challenges. Costs were mounting. Space was tightening. The toll on the team was increasing. One evening, Emily sat at her desk, scrolling through an endless series of spreadsheets with expense amounts and adoption records. She rubbed her temples in exasperation. "We need more help, Thomas. I don't know how much longer we can do this." Shunning the stress she was sending out, Thomas said, "Why don't we just do the corporate sponsor thing? Perhaps they can be donors or suppliers for it." Emily hesitated, but could hardly argue when he was right. They needed to think bigger if they were going to continue. Armed with new motivation, Emily and Thomas wrote up emails to local businesses explaining their mission and the difference they were making in the community. A few businesses were pleasantly receptive. A local pet food company pledged a year's supply of dog food, and a veterinary clinic offered free medical checkups for their rescues. "This is incredible," Emily said, smiling for the first time in days. "People really do care." While things were beginning to ease a bit on the financial front, the emotional toll of the work was something both Emily and Thomas were unprepared for. The touching stories, the hard decisions, and the long hours were weighing down. One night, after a particularly difficult day, Emily cried on the floor of the shelter with Max curled up next to her. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this," she whispered. Thomas knelt next to her and offered a comforting hand. "You don't have to do this by yourself, Em. We have a whole community of support behind us. And Max, he's a man of faith." Emily wiped tears, taking a deep breath. "I believe in this too. We keep going, one day at a time." Just when it felt like too much, an opportunity presented itself that I never anticipated. A major news outlet had gotten wind of their rescue mission and wanted to do a story. Emily was feeling nervous as well as excited. "This could really help us get to more people," she said to Thomas. "And get others to take action," he added. The interview went as well as they could have hoped. They discussed Max's story, what they had endured, and what they envisioned for the future. New interest was buzzing at the shelter, and donations poured in overnight. Through thick and thin, Emily discovered that true strength lay not in knowing all the facts, but in the determination, camaraderie, and unwavering faith that in the face of adversity, they were fighting for a cause worth fighting for. With Max curled up at her feet on the porch, she whispered, "We're not alone in this, buddy, and that matters all the difference." Max wagged his tail, his presence a reminder of why they were doing this, and agreed. "No matter the distance of the journey, we always end up where we are meant to be." Emily and Thomas looked back on everything they had accomplished and couldn't believe how their little idea had blossomed into something much bigger than they had thought possible. What began as a small moment of kindness for Max had transformed into a wave of empathy that swept over an entire town. One afternoon, she got a phone call from an unfamiliar number. It was Mrs. Thompson, the sweet old woman who had once cared for Max right before she brought him to the shelter. "Emily, sweetheart, I just wanted to tell you that my first gratitude engraved to you for all you've done for Buddy. I mean, Max," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice quivering with emotion. "No one could have ever imagined that I'd have to put my child in such loving hands." There were tears threading the corners of Emily's eyes, but she smiled. "He's changed my life, Mrs. Thompson, and now he is changing so many others." Tearing up at the touching moment, Emily and Thomas, inspired to do something special, decided to set up a special event to honor Max and all of the animals they had rescued over the years. They called it a Second Chance Celebration, a get-together to unite adopters, volunteers, and supporters. On the day of the event, the park resonated with laughter, wagging tails, and heartwarming tales of second chances. Families submitted their stories about their adopted pets, and Emily was flooded with gratitude. She mounted the stage, microphone in her palm, surveyed the crowd, inhaled deeply. "When I found Max, I thought I was giving him a second chance," she said. "But the fact is, he gave me one as well. And in doing so, we've made something larger than ourselves. This is the power of love and kindness." The audience superseded the stage in applause, and Emily felt a heavenly fulfillment surging through her. Later, Emily and Thomas sat on a bench in the park and watched Max play with the dogs. "So, what's next?" Thomas asked with a grin. Emily smiled. "I feel like this is only the beginning. We continue to grow. We continue to rescue. We continue to spread hope." Thomas nodded. "I'm with you, every step of the way." Emily gazed down at Max, who gazed up at her with unconditional love. "We're all in this together." As Emily headed home, Max waddling by her side, it occurred to her that home wasn't merely a location. It was love, commitment, and the people and animals who made life worth living. And with the stars above them, Emily whispered, "We've come full circle, Max, and I wouldn't change a thing." Max barked approvingly, his tail wagging, and the two vanished down the deserted road, prepared for whatever lay ahead. Hometown is not a geographical point. It is a vertical of sense and attitude. The sun was beginning to set that had united Emily, Thomas, and Max on the same journey. The shy and afraid canine had evolved into a beacon of hope and strength, changing innumerable lives throughout the journey. She sat on her porch, watching the horizon as Max curled up at her side. Gently stroking his fur, she thought of everything that had transpired, "We've come such a long way, haven't we?" she whispered. It seemed that Max understood exactly what Julie felt, looked up at her with loving eyes. As Max's second chance started gaining popularity and success, Emily and Thomas had an important decision to make. Should they expand their operations or keep it low-key and personal? As they sat over coffee one evening, Emily said to Thomas, "I think we could do more, so there are plenty of Maxes out there, just waiting for a permanent home." Thomas smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. Let's make this official. Let's start a full-time rescue center." They were thrilled as they spoke about what the future could hold. They contacted prospective donors, searched for volunteers, and even looked for a bigger building so they could take more dogs. While they were thinking about the future, Emily received a bittersweet phone call. Mrs. Thompson, Max's original owner, was going into a nursing home and wanted to see Max one last time. Max was brought to her by Emily, and as soon as Mrs. Thompson looked at him, she couldn't hold her tears back. "He looks so happy, Emily. I thank you for the beautiful life you gave him." Emily hugged her tightly. "He's brought more joy into my life than I thought possible." A celebration opened the rescue center 6 months later. It became a place for families who had adopted from them to come and share their story. Hope and happiness filled the room. Emily was in the entrance, looking as a young girl took a shy puppy. "This is something they all mean," she told Thomas. He nodded. "Every adoption, every second chance, it's worth it all." As Emily sat on her porch that night, she felt a deep sense of peace. "We did it, Max," she said quietly. Max wagged his tail and put his head on her lap. Home, Emily understood, was not only a place where you lay your head. It was love, perseverance, and the way we give second chances to those who need them most. And so their adventure went. One rescue, one story, one forever home at a time.